Fear doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary subway ride, until it isn't. The subway vigilante. When fear pulled the trigger. In the 1980s, New York City lived with fear in ways that rarely made headlines. It shaped daily routines, subway rides, and unspoken decisions people made without realizing it. On December 22, 1984, one ordinary ride forced the city to confront how fear, perception, and justice could collide, and what happens when fear is allowed to act first. The subway car did not feel dangerous at first. It rarely did. In New York City in the early 1980s, danger was not something that announced itself. It didn't come with raised voices or sudden movements. It lived quietly, folded into routine, disguised as normal life. People didn't talk about fear directly. They talked around it. They talked about which stations to avoid, which cars felt wrong, which hours were better than others. By 1984, the subway was no longer just a way to get from one place to another. It was a calculation, a series of small decisions made quickly and silently. Where to stand, where to look, how long to hold eye contact before it became something else. People learned these rules without being taught. Crime statistics were debated on the news, but on the platform, statistics didn't matter. Stories did. Someone robbed last week. Someone stabbed last month. Someone pushed onto the tracks. Each story traveled faster than the trains themselves, passed from stranger to stranger like a warning. Fear didn't scream, it whispered. The city was tired, financially strained, politically fragmented. Trust in institutions was thin, stretched by years of visible failure. Police were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Their presence did not always translate into safety. Sometimes it only reminded people of how fragile order really was. In the subway, everyone watched everyone else, but pretended they weren't. Eyes followed reflections in dark windows. People memorized exits without thinking about it. Bags were held tighter, bodies angled slightly away from strangers. These movements were small, almost invisible, but they were constant. Fear had become muscle memory. It didn't matter who you were. Office workers, students, tourists. The subway made everyone equal in one way. No one felt fully protected underground. The rules were different there, the margins thinner, the consequences immediate. People did not expect help. They expected themselves. That expectation changed things. It changed how moments were interpreted, how gestures were read, how words were weighed. Ordinary interactions became ambiguous. Neutral expressions became suspicious. Silence became safer than conversation. The city did not encourage trust. It rewarded caution. In this environment, fear stopped being an emotion and started functioning like a system. It organized behavior. It justified decisions. It explained reactions that might have seemed excessive in daylight. Above ground. Above ground, there were laws. Below ground, there were instincts. The subway did not create fear. It concentrated it. By the mid-1980s, people had stopped asking whether the city would protect them. The question had quietly shifted. What are you prepared to do if it doesn't? That question lived in the background of every ride, unspoken but present. A question without a clear answer, waiting for the wrong moment to surface. Most days, nothing happened. Most rides ended normally. Most fears remained hypothetical. But fear does not need an event to exist. It only needs the possibility. And in December of 1984, in New York City, that possibility felt close enough to touch. The subway doors closed, the train moved forward, and the city carried on, unaware that one ordinary ride was about to force it to confront how much power fear had already been given. Bernhard Goetz did not look dangerous. That detail mattered more than it should have. He was 37 years old, thin, slightly hunched, wire-rimmed glasses that slid down his nose when he moved too quickly. He dressed plainly, blending easily into the background of the city. The kind of man whose face would not stay in your memory after a brief encounter. If you passed him on the street, you would not cross to the other side. In New York City, where people learn to assess strangers in seconds, Goetz did not trigger alarms. He looked cautious, reserved, ordinary. But fear does not always show itself in posture or expression. Sometimes it settles deeper. Years before the subway shooting, Goetz had been attacked. A mugging that turned violent. He was beaten badly, thrown through a glass door, injured enough to require medical treatment. It was not the kind of assault that made headlines. It didn't turn him into a public figure. But it changed something fundamental. He survived. And survival, for some people, does not bring relief. It brings vigilance. After the attack, the city looked different to him. Familiar streets felt unpredictable. Ordinary encounters carried an edge. His body remembered the moment before his mind could process it. The shock, the helplessness, the realization that no one was coming to help. That realization stayed. Goetz began to see the city as a place where danger did not announce itself, where violence arrived quietly and left quickly, where hesitation could be costly. In that environment, fear did not feel irrational. It felt practical. He bought a gun. It was illegal to carry it without a permit, but legality felt secondary to safety. To Goetz, the weapon was not about power. It was about control, about making sure he would not be caught unprepared again. Fear has a way of reorganizing priorities. Friends later described him as tense, withdrawn, not aggressive but alert. A man always scanning his surroundings, always aware of who was near him, who was moving too quickly, who was paying too much attention. This was not paranoia, at least not in his own mind. This was preparation. The city seemed to confirm that belief every day. News reports, stories passed between strangers, warnings whispered on platforms. The subway, especially, felt like a space where normal rules were suspended. Below ground, people felt exposed. Goetz did not see himself as violent. He did not fantasize about confrontation. He did not seek it out. But he believed something important, that when danger came, he would recognize it. That belief would later become central to his defense. He believed he could tell the difference between an ordinary interaction and a threat, that his fear had been trained by experience, that it was informed. Fear, in this way, became a kind of expertise. But fear is not neutral. It filters perception. It compresses time. It fills in gaps with assumptions. And once it settles into the body, it does not wait for confirmation. By December of 1984, Goetz was not living in constant panic. He went to work. He took the subway. He lived a life that looked normal from the outside. But beneath that normalcy was a constant readiness, a belief that the city could turn on him at any moment. And when people live with that belief long enough, they begin to see moments not as they are, but as they could become. The line between caution and certainty grows thinner. On the day of the shooting, Goetz did not wake up intending to harm anyone. There is no evidence of planning, no manifesto, no declaration. Just a man moving through a city he no longer trusted, carrying a weapon he believed he might need. When the 4 teenagers approached him in the subway car, everything he carried inside him converged in seconds: past experience, cultural fear, personal trauma, the environment itself. The subway did not feel like a neutral space, it felt like a trap. Later, GOETZ would say he was sure. Sure they meant harm. Sure he recognized the pattern. That certainty would become the foundation of everything that followed. Not because it was provable, but because it was believable to enough people. This chapter is not about guilt or innocence. It is about how fear lives inside ordinary people, how it reshapes perception, how it convinces someone that action is not just justified, but necessary. Bernhard Goetz was not born a symbol. He became one the moment his internal fear met a public space already saturated with it. And once that happened, there was no separating the man from the moment. There was no time to be sure. The subway car was already moving when the doors closed. It was late afternoon, the hour when the city felt neither finished with the day nor ready for the night. People filled the car in that particular New York way, close but separate, bodies near each other, minds somewhere else. No one spoke. Winter coats brushed together, the metal floor vibrated beneath their feet, advertisements rattled slightly with each turn of the track. The air smelled faintly of oil, damp fabric, and impatience. Bernhard Goetz stood near the center of the car. He was not watching anyone directly. He didn't need to. The subway trained people to see without looking. Reflections in darkened windows, movement caught in peripheral vision, shifts in posture, changes in sound. Everything underground felt amplified. At the next stop, the doors opened and 4 teenagers stepped inside. They entered together. That detail would matter later. They did not rush. They did not run. They did not shout. Their presence was noticeable not because it was aggressive, but because it altered the balance of the car, a subtle redistribution of space, a change in sound. They moved closer. To most passengers, it might have looked like nothing, just young men boarding a train, just another moment in a city full of them. But moments are not interpreted equally by everyone. The teenagers approached GOETZ. One of them spoke. "How are you?" 3 words. Neutral. Ordinary, impossible to measure. In the closed environment of the subway car, words did not exist alone. They arrived carrying context, tone, distance, memory. The same sentence could be harmless or threatening depending on who heard it and what they were already carrying. GOETZ would later say that in that moment, everything became clear to him, that he believed he was about to be robbed, that he recognized the setup, that he knew what was coming next. There was no pause long enough to verify. Fear does not wait for confirmation. GOETZ reached into his jacket. The gun appeared quickly. The first shot shattered the routine of the car. Sound ricocheted off metal walls. Screams followed instinctively, not all at once, but in waves. Some people dropped to the floor. Others pressed themselves against the doors. A few stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. The second shot came almost immediately, then the third, then the fourth. The subway car was no longer a shared space. It was a confined one. Smoke hung briefly in the air. The smell of gunpowder cut through everything else. Time compressed into fragments. Flashes of movement, sharp sound, sudden silence. 4 teenagers lay on the floor. One of them, Daryl Caby, was still alive. He had been hit. He could not move. The car was screaming now. Someone was crying. Someone was shouting for help. Someone else was praying, quietly, as if volume might make things worse. GOETZ walked toward Caby. This moment would later be replayed in courtrooms, headlines, and arguments across the country, not because of what had already happened, but because of what happened next. Kabi was on the ground, wounded, no longer standing. GOETZ fired again. Later, he would say he wanted to make sure Kabi could never hurt anyone. At the time, there was no explanation, only the sound, the recoil, the finality of it. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The subway car was silent in a way that felt unnatural, not calm, emptied, as if everyone was holding their breath at the same time. GOETZ stepped away. When the doors opened at the next station, he exited the train. No speech, no hesitation, no declaration. He blended back into the city. Inside the car, passengers began to move again. Some rushed to the wounded. Others stumbled onto the platform, shaken, unsure whether their legs would hold them. Someone pulled the emergency cord. Sirens would come later. For now, there was only aftermath, blood on the floor, a broken routine, a question no one could yet answer. What had just happened? In the hours that followed, facts would be collected, statements taken, evidence logged. But the most important element, perception, had already escaped containment. Because by the time police arrived, the city had already begun to tell the story, and the story would not wait for certainty. The gun changed the space instantly. Before the first shot, the subway car had been crowded, uncomfortable, loud in its own quiet way. After the first shot, it became something else entirely. A sealed container for panic, a place where sound no longer behaved normally. Metal walls threw noise back at itself. The floor vibrated. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if it were resisting movement. The first shot broke routine. The second removed doubt. By the third, people were no longer reacting. They were surviving. Some dropped to the floor without thinking. Others pressed themselves into corners, against doors, against strangers. A few stood frozen, bodies locked in place while their minds struggled to keep up. Fear does not move evenly. It spreads in bursts. 4 teenagers were hit. Their bodies collapsed in different ways, at different speeds, as if gravity itself had lost consistency. What they'd been doing seconds earlier no longer mattered. The subway floor became the only shared destination. The car filled with sound, screaming, shouting, breath pulled too fast into lungs that didn't have time to decide what to do with it. Someone yelled for help. Someone else yelled for the train to stop. The train did not stop. In moments like this, time stops behaving. Seconds stretch, sequences blur. Later, witnesses would disagree about order, distance, timing. Not because they were lying, but because fear fractures memory. One of the teenagers, Daryl Cubby, was still alive. He lay on the floor, wounded, unable to move. His body had already absorbed the shock of the first moments. What remained was confusion, pain, and the sudden realization that the situation was not over. GOETZ walked toward him. This movement would become the center of the case, not the first shots, not the screams, not even the weapon itself. This step. The subway car, already overwhelmed, seemed to hold its breath. There was no instruction manual for this moment, no shared understanding among the passengers about what came next. Kabi was down, not running, not standing, not advancing. GOETZ later said he believed Kabi was dangerous, that he could get up, that he could attack, that the threat had not ended. Fear does not measure distance the way reason does. GOETZ fired again. The sound landed differently this time. It was not lost in chaos, it cut through it. This shot did not feel reactive, it felt deliberate. That perception, whether accurate or not, would follow the case everywhere, in courtrooms, in headlines. in conversations that had nothing to do with the subway, but everything to do with power. After the final shot, the noise in the car changed. Screams became scattered, movements slowed. People began to register what had happened instead of simply reacting to it. The gun was no longer firing. The threat, whatever it had been, was no longer unfolding. What remained was damage. GOETZ stepped back. There was no speech, no visible hesitation, no attempt to explain. He did not look for approval or reaction. He did not wait for police. He did not stay. When the train reached the next station and the doors opened, he exited. Just another passenger leaving the car. Inside, the subway finally stopped feeling like motion. It became a scene, a place where people stared at their hands, at the floor, at each other, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Blood on the metal floor. A gunshot echo that refused to fade. 4 bodies that moments ago had been standing. The emergency cord was pulled. Voices shouted for help. Someone tried to comfort KB. Someone else turned away, unable to look. Fear had done its work. Now consequences remained. The question that would define the entire case was already forming. Not out loud, but inside every person who tried to make sense of the moment. When did this stop being self-defense? No one in the subway car could answer that, and that uncertainty would become the most powerful evidence of all. When Bernhard GOETZ stepped off the subway train, the city swallowed him whole. There was no pursuit, no dramatic escape, no crowd pointing fingers. He exited the car the same way thousands of people did every day, through an open door, onto a familiar platform, into motion. The subway doors closed behind him, sealing the violence inside. Above ground, the city was still functioning. Traffic moved, storefronts stayed open, people crossed streets with coffee cups in their hands. Life continued, indifferent to what had just happened underground. GOETZ blended into it. This was New York, a place where anonymity was not suspicious, it was expected. A man leaving a subway station did not attract attention. He did not need to hide. He only needed to keep moving. By the time emergency services arrived at the scene, the person who had fired the gun was gone. Inside the subway car, time slowed. Police tape appeared. Paramedics worked quickly. Witnesses tried to explain what they had seen, but explanations came apart under pressure. Stories conflicted, details shifted. Outside the car, the city began asking questions. Who did this? Why? And where did he go? For days, Bernhard GOETZ did not exist in public. There were no photos, no interviews, no name, only a description, vague, incomplete, filtered through shock and fear. A thin man, glasses, a gun. The absence became part of the story. In that absence, something else moved in. Speculation. New York filled the silence with its own voice. Radio shows debated motives, newspapers printed theories, television panels invited experts who knew nothing about the man, but everything about fear. The shooter was no longer a person. He was a concept. Someone people projected onto. Someone imagined differently depending on what they already believed. To some, he was a coward who ran. To others, a citizen who knew better than to trust the system. The longer GOETZ remained unseen, the more powerful the narrative became. Fear does not like uncertainty. It rushes to complete the picture. Police searched, but not urgently enough to calm the public. Rumors spread that the shooter had supporters, that people were protecting him, that he was hiding in plain sight. Each rumor added weight. Then, days later, Bernhard GOETZ did something unexpected. He turned himself in. Not in New York, in New Hampshire, far from the subway, far from the city that had already decided who he was. When his name became public, the reaction was immediate. Headlines changed tone. Faces replaced sketches. A real person emerged, and with him, new arguments. GOETZ was no longer just the shooter. He was a man who had been attacked before, a man who feared the subway, a man who carried a gun because he believed he had to. Support letters arrived, money followed. People who had never met him saw themselves in him. They recognized his fear as their own. Others saw something else. They saw flight, avoidance, a man who left before accountability arrived. Disappearance had given him time for the story to form without him, time for fear to pick sides. By the time Bernhard Goetz stood in front of cameras, the balance of power had shifted. The event was no longer being investigated in isolation. It was being weighed against the city's collective anxiety. The question was no longer just what happened in that subway car. It was what the city wanted the answer to be. Goetz's disappearance had created space, and in that space, fear had rewritten the rules. What happened next would divide the city. The name came before the facts. It appeared in bold letters, stretched across newspapers, repeated on television screens, spoken aloud by voices that had never been in that subway car. It arrived fully formed, confident, decisive. The subway vigilante. Two words that did more than describe. They framed. They instructed. Before investigators had finished collecting statements, before evidence had been sorted into meaning, the story had already been packaged. A name had been chosen, and with it, a direction. Vigilante suggested intention. It suggested purpose. It suggested a kind of justice. The media did not invent fear. It recognized it and gave it language. News anchors spoke carefully, but the implication was clear. This was not just a shooting. This was a response. A reaction to a city that had lost control of its streets and its subways. A citizen stepping in where the system had failed. Headlines did not ask what happened. They asked what it meant. Panels filled with experts, criminologists, former police officers, commentators, people who understood crime statistics but had not felt the metal floor of that subway car vibrate beneath their feet. They spoke in calm voices about fear, about urban decay, about personal responsibility. The word context was repeated often. Context softened edges. Context excused hesitation. Context allowed space for understanding, and sometimes for approval. Photographs of Bernhard Goetz circulated. He looked exactly as people expected, and exactly as they needed him to look. Not threatening, not imposing, ordinary. Someone who could be mistaken for a neighbor. That mattered. Images of the four teenagers were harder to place. Their names were mentioned less often. Their faces appeared briefly, then disappeared. When they were discussed, it was usually in relation to Goetz's fear, not their own lives. The story narrowed. Television segments replayed the event in simplified terms. A dangerous subway, 4 young men, 1 man with a gun. Fear met action, action met consequence. What was lost in repetition was uncertainty. The final shot became a footnote in some reports. In others, it was ignored entirely. The question of when danger ends did not fit easily into a narrative built on inevitability. The media prefers clean arcs, hero, villain, resolution. But this story resisted resolution, so the edges were trimmed. Call-in radio shows lit up, voices filled the airwaves, people spoke as if they had been there, as if they knew exactly what they would have done in that situation, as if fear behaved the same way for everyone. I would have done the same. He had no choice. This is what happens when criminals run the city. The language hardened quickly. Fear found reinforcement. The more the name Subway Vigilante was repeated, the less room there was for nuance. Vigilantes do not hesitate. They act. They decide. They take responsibility, or so the story goes. What the media created was not just a label. It created permission. Permission to interpret the shooting not as a tragedy, but as a statement. Permission to see it as a warning. Permission to imagine that fear could be converted into order. Critics tried to slow the narrative. Civil rights groups spoke out. Community leaders questioned the framing. They pointed to race, to power, to the uneven distribution of empathy. Those voices struggled to compete with a story that already felt complete. Because the media had not just named the man, it had named the moment. By the time Bernhard Goetz appeared publicly, the story had momentum. It moved faster than evidence, faster than legal process, faster than reflection. The name stuck. And once it did, it became difficult to ask quieter questions. Questions like, who decides when fear justifies violence? Whose fear is considered reasonable? And what happens when a headline feels more convincing than the truth? The media did not pull the trigger, but it decided how the echo would sound. The reaction did not come all at once. It spread, quietly at first, in conversations overheard on sidewalks, in offices where people lowered their voices before saying what they really thought, in subway cars where strangers exchanged brief glances that carried entire opinions. New York did not argue as a single voice. It fractured. Some people spoke with certainty. They said what had happened was inevitable, that anyone who rode the subway long enough understood the risk, that fear was not paranoia, it was experience. They talked about the city the way people talk about a threat they've already accepted. This was bound to happen. He did what the police couldn't. You can't expect people to just wait to be attacked. For them, Bernhard Goetz was not a stranger. He was a stand-in, a version of themselves pushed into a corner, a person who had reached a limit they secretly believed existed for everyone. Letters arrived at his home. Money was mailed in envelopes. Strangers offered support without being asked. The gesture mattered. It meant that fear was not private. It was shared, validated, reinforced. Others watched this unfold with disbelief. They saw 4 teenagers shot, one left permanently paralyzed, a system that seemed to hesitate when violence aligned with public anxiety. They asked why sympathy moved so quickly in one direction and stalled in the other. Community leaders spoke out. Civil rights organizations organized protests. They talked about race, about perception, about how easily fear attaches itself to certain bodies. They asked a different set of questions. Why was GOETZ's fear treated as understandable, even logical, while the teenager's presence was framed as threatening? Why was the benefit of the doubt distributed unevenly? Those questions did not sit comfortably in a city already tense. At dinner tables, families argued. At bars, voices rose. On talk radio, callers shouted over one another. The city was not just debating a shooting, it was debating itself. Race hovered over every conversation, even when it was not named. Class did too. So did geography. Who rode the subway by necessity and who rode it by choice. Fear, it turned out, was not experienced equally. Some New Yorkers felt seen for the first time. Others felt exposed. In some neighborhoods, GOETZ's name was spoken with approval. In others, it became a warning. a sign that the rules had changed, or that they had never been fair to begin with. The divide was not clean. It did not follow simple lines. People who agreed on little else found themselves aligned, while neighbors discovered they stood on opposite sides of something they had never discussed before. Public reaction did not clarify the event, it complicated it. Because once a city chooses sides, facts become secondary. Each detail is filtered through belief. Evidence is weighed differently depending on where fear already lives. GOETZ was no longer just a man facing charges. He was a symbol people used to say what they had been afraid to say out loud. The subway shooting became a proxy, a way to argue about safety, about power, about whose lives were considered fragile and whose were considered dangerous. By the time the legal system began its slow work, the city had already rendered dozens of verdicts. Not all of them would ever be spoken, but all of them would matter. What happened on that subway car was no longer just a police matter. It had become a public argument, shaped by fear, amplified by headlines, and repeated until certainty felt optional. By the time the city chose a side, the facts were already struggling to keep up. Next on True Echoes. In Part 2, the focus shifts from the subway to the courtroom. As public opinion grows louder, the law is forced to decide whether fear can be considered reasonable, and who gets to define it. Part 2, the truth coming soon on True Echoes. What began as a single moment underground didn't stay there. It moved into headlines, conversations, and judgments made far from the subway car itself. Fear was no longer private. It was shared, debated, and defended. And as the city argued over what felt justified, another question waited quietly in the background. How does the law respond when fear speaks first? What do you think? Where do you draw the line between fear and justice? This is a story without easy answers. To be continued.